The council chamber of the Zorak Coalition was about as welcoming as a dentist's office, if your dentist was a bloodthirsty xenomorph with a penchant for public executions. The room was a cathedral of dull gray metal, punctuated by flickering lights that seemed to scream budget cuts more than intergalactic powerhouse. Councillor Vectel sat at the long table, surrounded by representatives from various alien empires who were all vying for the most unimpressive poker face award. They looked like a mismatched collection of taxidermy projects gone horribly wrong. Vectel, with his leathery skin and a face that could curdle milk, surveyed the room with the enthusiasm of a mortician at a wake. "I move that we address the issue of the human music broadcasts," Vectel intoned, his voice as dry as the desert planet he hailed from. Immediately, there was a murmur of discontent, like a choir of disgruntled bees. "Why do we care about these barbarian noisemakers?" grumbled Zarnok, a gelatinous blob of a creature who seemed to sweat slime at the mere mention of humans. "Because," Vectel said, with the patience of a saint and the demeanor of a grumpy old man, "it's not just noise, it's persistent, increasing. And somehow, it's starting to unify these scattered colonies." The word unify was a grenade thrown into the room, and everyone flinched. Unity was as rare in this corner of the universe as a vegan at a steakhouse. We let them play their little tunes, and next thing you know, they're organizing revolts, dancing in synchronized movements, shaking their asses in our direction, Vectel continued, each word dripping with sarcasm. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples as though the very thought pained him. "It's just a phase," snorted Olgoth, whose face resembled a melted candle. "They'll tire of their own screeching soon enough." "Maybe," Vectel replied, raising a finger. "Or maybe it's like a plague, starts small, but then everyone catches it, and we're all doomed to endure Sweet Home Alabama until our ears bleed." There was a collective shudder. Even beings who communicated through pheromones and tentacle gestures had heard the horror stories of human music. "What do you propose, Vectel?" asked Tyrol, who looked like a cross between a peacock and a hedgehog dressed for a funeral. "We need to investigate. Send someone to the source, try to ascertain why this music is spreading, and more importantly, how we can stop it," Vectel declared, his tone as grim as a tax audit. A silence fell over the chamber, heavy and oppressive like a fart in a spacesuit. "And who do you suggest we send to this lovely task?" Tyrol asked, her beady eyes glittering with malignant curiosity. "Why not you, Vectel?" Zarnok suggested, managing to look simultaneously amused and nauseated. Vectel sighed, a deep, soul-weary sound that spoke volumes about the weight of leadership. "I suppose someone has to have the pleasure," he said, each word a reluctant drag. Olgoth slapped a pseudopod on the table in what might have been intended as applause. "Brave of you, Vectel. If you come back humming, we'll know humans have finally broken you." "Yes, how horrifically noble of me," Vectel muttered. "I'll make sure to pack extra earplugs. If anyone wants to join me, there's plenty of room on the shuttle." Not a single alien moved. It was as if he'd suggested a group bath in acid. "Thought so," he said, standing up and squaring his shoulders. "Very well, prepare a ship, and someone find me a comprehensive guide to human music. I want to know exactly what kind of hell I'm walking into." The council began to disperse, each representative eager to return to their various empires and resume the important business of ignoring their constituents. Vectel lingered, his mind swirling with thoughts of impending doom and disastrous disco. As he walked out, he couldn't help but chuckle. "Who knew," he muttered to himself, "that humanity's greatest weapon would be a catchy tune?" Vectel made his way to the hangar, where the shuttle waited like a metallic vulture ready to pick at the carcass of his career. He climbed aboard with all the enthusiasm of a condemned man taking his last walk. "Welcome aboard, Counselor Vectel," chirped the ship's AI, its voice a gratingly cheerful parody of hospitality. "Can the pleasantries metalhead?" Vectel snapped. "Just get us to the coordinates without any AI karaoke sessions, all right?" "Of course, Counselor," the AI responded, its tone unflappably sunny. Though I must say, human music is quite infectious. You might find yourself tapping your foot before long." Vectel grumbled a response that was lost beneath the roar of the engines as the shuttle took off. As he sat back, he tried to remember why he'd ever thought politics was a good career choice. Probably because his other options were cattle herder or unpaid intern. Space unfolded around him, a vast emptiness that felt comforting in its indifference. Out here, away from the Council's ceaseless bickering and the looming threat of a universe unified by pop ballads, Vectel found a moment of peace. Approaching the source of the broadcasts, the AI announced, shattering the moment like a thrown rock through a glass window. "Great," Vectel muttered, leaning forward to peer at the monitor. The screen displayed a small, nondescript planet that looked about as promising as a dust speck. "From here, Counselor, it appears to be a human colony. Mostly abandoned, but the broadcasts are coming from there," the AI continued, with the enthusiasm of a tour guide pointing out a landfill. Vectel sighed again, his favorite hobby these days. "Let's get on with it then. No point delaying the inevitable." The shuttle landed with a shuddering thud, and Vectel stepped out onto the planet's surface, where the air tasted like disappointment and stagnant water. "Lovely place," he remarked to no one in particular, the sarcasm thick enough to cut with a knife. As he trudged towards the source of the broadcasts, Vectel couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking into the beginning of a very bad joke. An alien counselor walks into a human colony. The planetary installation was a relic of what had once been a bustling hub, now reduced to a ghost town of decrepit buildings and broken dreams. The music was louder here, a cacophony of human voices singing about love, loss, and questionable life choices in a variety of tempos. "If this doesn't drive me mad, nothing will," Vectel muttered, stepping inside the central building where the music was at its loudest. What awaited him inside was a makeshift communications rig, a tangled mess of wires and jury-rigged equipment that looked like it had been assembled by a particularly determined raccoon. "Well, there's your problem," he said dryly, approaching the console. "Who'd have thought humans would weaponize audio engineering?" He fiddled with the controls, trying to make sense of the chaotic display. The music continued unabated, each note drilling deeper into his skull. Suddenly, a hologram flickered to life, displaying a human figure who looked more surprised than Vectel felt. Hello," the figure said, their voice crackling through the speakers. "Hello yourself," Vectel replied, crossing his arms. "Mind explaining why your music is causing a diplomatic crisis?" The human looked taken aback, then grinned. "Oh, yeah, sorry about that. It's just, we found these old playlists, you know. Thought it might be fun to share with the universe. Didn't think it'd cause such a fuss." "Fun," Vectel repeated, the word tasting foreign in his mouth. "You do realize your fun is potentially inciting intergalactic war, right?" The human shrugged. "Music does that sometimes. Hits you right in the feels." Vectel pinched the bridge of his nose. "Listen, can you at least turn it down a notch? The last thing we need is a united human uprising set to the tune of Bohemian Rhapsody." The hologram laughed, a sound that was simultaneously infuriating and disarming. "I'll see what I can do, but you should try listening to it sometime." "Might grow on you." "Unlikely," Vectel replied, though his lips twitched at the edges. "And if this gets out of hand, I'll hold you personally responsible." The human saluted, a gesture that seemed entirely too playful for the situation. "Understood, Counselor." As the hologram winked out, Vectel turned to leave, his mind a whirl of conflicting emotions. On the one hand, he'd successfully confronted the source of the music. On the other, he had a sinking feeling that this was only the beginning of a much larger problem. "Next time," Vectel muttered as he made his way back to the shuttle, "I'll volunteer for the Committee on Asteroid Mining. At least rocks don't sing." He boarded the shuttle, the music still echoing in his ears like a maddening, persistent itch. As they lifted off, he couldn't help but think that maybe, just maybe, this whole ordeal wasn't as terrible as it seemed. After all, It wasn't every day you got to experience firsthand the musical stylings of a species that believed more cowbell was an acceptable artistic direction. Set course for home, Vectel instructed the AI, who dutifully complied. As the stars streaked by, Vectel closed his eyes and allowed himself a moment of reprieve. The music was still there, humming at the back of his mind. Maybe it wasn't all bad, he thought. Maybe there was something to this human music after all, but he'd be damned if he admitted it to anyone. Vectel's shuttle landed on Clavius with a heavy thud, the kind that said, "You're here, whether you like it or not." The planet, one of humanity's misplaced toys, was as inviting as a porcupine in a petting zoo. Its surface was littered with the remnants of technology that time and neglect had turned into nothing more than twisted sculptures of forgotten ambition. "Welcome, Counselor Vectel," the AI chirped, still inappropriately enthusiastic given the circumstances. "I'm detecting continuous audio signals from the central hub." "Of course you are," Vectel muttered, stepping out onto ground that felt as solid as his resolve not to be infected by tunes. "Anything else I should know?" "Booby traps. Cannibalistic DJ unlikely, Counselor." "However, life signs are present," the AI replied, managing to sound both helpful and irritating. "Fantastic," Vectel grumbled, trudging towards the source of the music. The air had a stale quality, like it had been washed too many times in the same pair of socks. Old buildings loomed over him, shadows of their former selves, now little more than cozy homes for dust and regret. The music grew louder with each step. It was a medley of Earth's greatest hits, if by greatest you meant songs that guaranteed headaches and existential dread. Vectel winced as he entered the central hub, half expecting a welcoming committee of singing holograms. Instead, he found Corin. The human looked as out of place as a clown at a funeral, lounging against a jury-rigged console with the casual air of someone who didn't quite grasp the concept of being the last human in a forgotten colony. His hair was a messy halo around a face that seemed to perpetually smirk. "Well, if it isn't my favorite alien diplomat," Corin said, grinning as if he'd been expecting Vectel all along. "Welcome to Clavius, the galaxy's premier destination for musical enlightenment." Vectel crossed his arms, trying to ignore the itch of irritation that Corin's presence provoked. "Enlightenment? This noise is more like psychological warfare," Corin laughed, a sound that was far too cheerful for Vectel's liking. "Depends on how you look at it. Some say music is the universal language. Maybe if the universe was deaf," Vectel shot back, moving closer to the console. Corin pushed himself upright, his expression shifting from amusement to something more sincere. "Look, I get it. The music's a bit much, but it's not just noise, it's a message, a message." Vectel echoed, raising a brow. "And what's the message?" "Hello from the grave." Corin shook his head, eyes gleaming with a mix of determination and madness, or maybe just a hangover. "It's a call to what's left of us. A reminder that we're still here, still kicking, and still more stubborn than a mule on a diet." Vectel frowned, eyeing the tangled mess of wires and screens. "Seems like a roundabout way to say you're lonely." Corin shrugged. "You're not entirely wrong, but there's more to it. These songs, they're historical markers. Each one is tied to a moment or a place. It's like a map if you know how to read it." "A map," Vectel snorted. "Of what?" "Bad taste of Earth." "Of home," Corin said, and for a moment the bravado slipped, revealing something raw and urgent beneath. "We've scattered, sure, but we're not lost." "Not really." Vectel sighed, the sound of a man deeply tired of surprises. "So how does it end up here, messing with my job and my eardrums?" Corin leaned back, crossing his arms like he was about to deliver the punchline to a cosmic joke. "Because someone started listening. Someone else out there picked up the signal and decided it needed to go further. It's not a threat, it's a beacon." "A beacon," Vectel repeated, skepticism thick in his voice. "Your kind has an interesting way of saying hello. That's humanity for you," Corin replied with a grin. "Always making a mess. Always finding a way to make it mean something." Vectel rubbed his temples, the pounding of the music relentless. And what do you expect me to do with this information? Corin shrugged again, the universal gesture of I don't know, but it seemed like a good idea at the time. Spread it. Shut it down. Up to you, really. But if you shut it down, you destroy the map, and no one finds their way home. There was a pause as Vectel weighed his options, the silence filled with the persistent hum of old songs and new dilemmas. It was a devil's bargain, one he'd prefer to avoid. But if there was one thing worse than a universe united under pop music, it was him being responsible for extinguishing the last lights of a lost people. Fine, Vectel said at last, the word dragged out like a reluctant confession. I'll report what I've found, but no promises on what the council decides. Fair enough, Counselor, Corin replied, offering a hand. Thanks for not shutting it down. Yet Vectel took the hand, shaking it cautiously as if it might explode. I didn't do it for you, human, of course not, Corin said, that infuriating grin back in place. Just remember, music has a funny way of bringing people together, Vectel snorted, or tearing them apart. As he turned to leave, the music swelled behind him, a symphony of defiance and hope that clung stubbornly to the edges of his consciousness. It was maddening and infuriating and somehow, against his better judgment, a little bit inspiring. Back at the shuttle, the AI greeted him with its usual unflappable cheer. All set, Counselor. Just get me out of here, Vectel replied, settling into his seat as the engines roared to life. As they lifted off, he allowed himself a final glance at Clavius, the planet shrinking beneath them like a fading memory. Maybe Corin was right. Maybe it was a message worth hearing. Or maybe it was just another layer of chaos in an already chaotic universe. Either way, Vectel thought, it was going to make for one hell of a council meeting. Vectel's shuttle had barely cooled its thrusters when he and Corin were back at the central hub, standing amidst a tangle of wires that could double as an electronic spaghetti nightmare. Vectel surveyed the scene with the expression of someone who'd rather be cleaning out xenomorph cages. Corin, oblivious to Vectel's discomfort or perhaps delighting in it, was rummaging through the archives like a kid in a candy store that had been shut down for health violations. So, Corin began, his voice laden with the kind of enthusiasm that made Vectel itch, you want to see what this mess has to offer. I'd rather have my antennae pulled out one by one, Vectel muttered, glancing sideways at Corin. But since we're here, enlighten me with your so-called treasures. Corin grinned, showing more teeth than Vectel thought was strictly necessary. All right, Grumpy. Let's see what the old colony left behind. With a flair that suggested he fancied himself the star of some interstellar drama, Corin tapped away at the console. The screens flickered to life, spilling text and images in a chaotic dance of information overload. Vectel squinted at the blur, silently cursing his lack of caffeine. Here we go, Corin announced, pointing at a particular file highlighted like it had won a cosmic lottery. This one's encrypted, probably important. Vectel leaned in, trying to decipher the mess. Encrypted, huh? And here I thought you humans loved sharing everything with everyone. Corin chuckled, shaking his head. Not when it comes to this. These files contain encoded messages. Something only meant for human eyes or ears, I suppose. Vectel crossed his arms, a gesture that had become second nature around the infuriating human. And what's so important that it needed to be hidden away like an embarrassing family secret? Messages, Corin said, his tone taking on an unexpected seriousness. For the surviving colonies, directions maybe. Or warnings. A treasure map to misery, Vectel remarked dryly. Sounds about right. Corin's fingers danced over the keyboard, each keystroke a hopeful prayer to the digital gods. Ah, here we go. Found a way to decrypt it. The screen shifted, displaying lines of text that to Vectel looked like they'd been assembled by a drunken poet. But Corin's eyes narrowed as he scanned the data with intent. See right here, Corin tapped the screen. This file references Bohemian Rhapsody. It's a coded directive. Each song broadcasts specific data, coordinates, timestamps, instructions. Vectel's antennae twitched with skepticism. And who was this genius who thought Bohemian Rhapsody would be a good idea for intergalactic communication? Some genius on Earth, or what was left of it, Corin replied, unfazed. They used songs everyone would remember, all part of the plan to guide the lost sheep back to the fold. Sheep, Vectel snorted. More like lemmings running off a cliff, Corin shrugged. Either way, it's clever. If you know the song, you can follow the message. Vectel raised a brow, his disbelief hanging in the air like a bad odor. And what do these messages say? Howdy from the past, wish you were here. Corin shook his head. More like keep hope alive. These broadcasts were a way to keep colonists connected, to remind us we're not alone even if it feels that way. Vectel rubbed his temples, the weight of impending intergalactic melodrama settling heavily on his shoulders. And does the Council know about this? They've got wind of the music, sure, Corin said, leaning back with an air of nonchalance. But they think it's a weapon, some kind of human sabotage. Vectel chuckled darkly. Wouldn't put it past your kind. You love a good pyrotechnic finale, Corin grinned. We like to make an impression, but this, it's not a threat, it's a lifeline. Try telling the Council that, Vectel replied, his tone dripping with irony. They're already tying themselves in knots, convinced this is the start of another human war. Meanwhile, on the distant council chamber, paranoia was spreading like a bad rash. Zarnok, a gelatinous blob who looked like he'd be more at home in a horror movie than a council meeting, was oozing concern. The music, he gurgled, each word punctuated by droplets of slime. It could be a Trojan horse. Humans are unpredictable. Olgoth, whose face seemed to melt further with each passing Ior, nodded solemnly. It's possible. Remember what happened with the last human fad. The dance craze nearly destroyed 5 planets. Counselor Vectel's proxy, a hologram of stoic indifference, was present as a placeholder in these meetings. The real Vectel, of course, was busy dealing with the mess firsthand, but his absence didn't stop the council from spinning out of control. Back on Clavius, Corin was trying to explain the intricacies of human music theory to Vectel, who looked as though he'd rather be subjected to a root canal without anesthetic. These songs, Corin said, gesturing at the console, they're not just catchy tunes. They're historical records. Each one is a piece of humanity, a snapshot of what once was. History disguised as a headache, Vectel muttered, still unconvinced. And what are the council supposed to do with this? They're convinced you're plotting some grand scheme. Corin sighed, his bravado dimming for a split second. They have to understand, this isn't about war. It's about survival. And you think a few catchy tunes will make them see the light? Vectel asked, skepticism practically radiating from him. Corin shrugged. Stranger things have happened. Name one, Vectel challenged. Corin grinned. You're standing on it. This planet was a failed colony, yet here it is, still kicking, still broadcasting. If that's not a miracle, I don't know what is. Vectel had to admit the human had a point. In their own chaotic way, humans were remarkably resilient, like cockroaches with charisma. So what's the plan, then? Vectel asked, looking at the screen filled with encrypted music files. How do we convince the council this isn't some intergalactic karaoke apocalypse? Corin leaned back, crossing his arms in thought. Maybe we don't. Maybe we just let the music speak for itself, and let them come to the wrong conclusions, Vectel retorted, or the right ones, Corin countered. They have to see that humanity isn't the enemy here. The enemy is isolation, disconnection. The music's a bridge. Vectel shook his head. You've got more faith in them than I do, Corin chuckled. Not faith. Just a stubborn belief that when faced with the truth, even the most paranoid alien can see reason. Vectel didn't share Corin's optimism, but he took some small solace in the fact that this wasn't just his mess to clean up. Fine, but if this goes sideways, I'm putting you in charge of the cleanup. Deal, Corin replied, his grin once again lighting up his features. But trust me, counselor, music has a way of changing the tune of any situation. Vectel snorted. Especially when the alternative is silence. As they prepared to face the council, Vectel couldn't help but feel like he was walking into a den of ill-tempered predators armed with nothing but a boom box. The music might be the key to uniting the scattered remnants of humanity, but convincing a council that saw humans as a ticking time bomb, that was a different symphony altogether. Still, if Corin was right, and if the music could indeed serve as a bridge rather than a blockade, it might just be the melody needed to drown out the discord of a fractured universe. But Vectel knew better than to count his victories before they were sung. He adjusted his stance, ready for whatever discord awaited. After all, if the universe was anything, it was a relentless composer of chaos, and Vectel was just one more player in its twisted symphony. Vectel had barely settled into his usual state of existential dread when the council pinged him with a summons so urgent it might as well have come with a side of heart palpitations. The Zorak Coalition Council chamber loomed ahead, its dull gray walls making him feel like he was about to face a firing squad with a Nerf gun. "Great," he muttered to himself, adjusting the collar of his uniform, which was as comfortable as a straitjacket made of sandpaper. Another delightful session with the galaxy's most paranoid minds. Corin, who had somehow managed to perfect the art of looking both infuriatingly relaxed and irritatingly excited, caught up with him, practically bouncing on his heels. "Hey, maybe they've got snacks this time," he said with a grin so wide it could probably be picked up by passing satellites. "Yeah, because nothing says diplomatic crisis like a cheese platter," Vectel replied, rolling his eyes. "Let's just get this over with." The council wasn't known for its hospitality or its patience, and today was no exception. Vectel could feel their collective gaze boring into him as he entered the chamber, each set of eyes critiquing his every step, probably picturing him as a scapegoat on a spit. "Counselor Vectel," Zarnok greeted, his gelatinous form quivering with what might have been impatience or just his usual state of perpetual wetness. "We require an immediate solution to this human music crisis." Vectel resisted the urge to point out that calling it a crisis was about as accurate as calling interstellar war a minor disagreement. Instead, he nodded curtly. "I understand the council's concerns." Olgoth, looking like he'd melted further since yesterday, leaned forward with the grace of a drunken sloth. "The broadcasts are increasing," he said, voice dripping with melodrama. "We must act before humanity uses this as a weapon." Corin interrupted, his voice smooth but insistent. "It's not a weapon. The music is a coded communication network." "Network?" Zarnok gurgled, a glob of slime splattering onto the table. "Preposterous. Humans have never been that organized." "Listen," Corin said, his tone shifting to the kind of patience usually reserved for explaining quantum physics to a toddler. "These songs are messages, directions for surviving colonies. They're connecting pockets of humanity, not plotting an invasion." "Or so you say," Olgoth grumbled, his skepticism as thick as his face was droopy. "But how can we trust this interpretation?" Vectel sighed, a sound that echoed his deep-seated desire to be anywhere else. "Corin has deciphered part of a message. It hints at a network among the colonies. They're using music to stay in touch, not to rally troops." The council exchanged glances, the kind of silent conversation that usually preceded someone getting thrown out an airlock. Zarnok's eyes narrowed, and Vectel could tell he was itching to declare this some kind of human plot. "Prove it," Zarnok challenged, his tone as slippery as his exterior. Corin nodded, already one step ahead. "I've got the decrypted message here," he said, pulling a device from his pocket like a magician revealing a particularly unimpressive rabbit. "It talks about colonies supporting each other, sharing resources." "It's a lifeline." Olgoth squinted at the device, suspicion practically oozing from his pores. "And why should we believe you? You're a human after all." Vectel resisted the urge to facepalm. "Because starting a war over a misunderstanding is the kind of bad decision that gets you remembered for all the wrong reasons," he interjected, his voice cutting through the tension like a rusty scalpel. The chamber fell silent, the kind of heavy silence that usually heralded either enlightenment or an explosive argument. Knowing this counsel, Vectel put his money on the latter. You expect us to trust a species that once nearly destroyed itself over a dance craze? Ulgoth sneered, alluding to a historical hiccup that had become the stuff of legends, or cautionary tales at least. Corin shrugged, unruffled. We learn from our mistakes, sometimes, but this time the music is a tool for survival, not destruction. Vectel glanced at his human counterpart, appreciating his ability to remain optimistic in the face of overwhelming skepticism. If this network is real, it could mean an opportunity for alliances, Vectel ventured, playing the only card he had left. We could help these colonies. Strengthen ties instead of severing them. Alliances, Zarnok echoed, his tone dripping with disbelief, as if Vectel had suggested they all go on a group holiday to the sun. With humans, Corin smirked. Why not? You might even like us once you get past the awkward introductions. Ulgoth scoffed, but Vectel saw a flicker of consideration in his tired eyes. And if we don't act, what then? Do we let paranoia guide us into another conflict? Zarnok hesitated, his form slackening into a thoughtful puddle. Perhaps there is merit in observing this network further, but we must tread carefully. Vectel nodded, suppressing his relief. Agreed. We're not suggesting blind trust, just not jumping into a pit of vipers without checking if they are actually snakes. Corin chuckled at the analogy, earning him a sidelong glance from Vectel. Hey, I like the way you put things. Makes the whole potential war thing sound almost manageable. Vectel sighed. If only it were that simple. The council's debate continued, growing more heated than a supernova on a caffeine binge. But Vectel knew he had done what he could to keep them from pressing the big red button marked doom. For now. As the session wound down, Corin tapped Vectel on the shoulder. You think they'll actually listen? Vectel shrugged. They'll consider it. They're more afraid of looking stupid than they are of actual danger. And what about you? Corin asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. Do you trust us? Vectel thought for a moment, weighing the potential for disaster against the slim chance of cooperation. Look, he finally said, I don't trust anyone. But maybe that's why it could work. Corin grinned, the kind of grin that said he was used to people underestimating him. Then we've got something in common. As they left the council chamber, Vectel couldn't shake the feeling that he was tiptoeing on the edge of a razor blade. But perhaps, just perhaps, the music blaring across the galaxy wasn't heralding humanity's downfall, but its second chance. One more thing, Corin added as they walked. Any chance we can get them to swap out some of the tracks for something a bit more upbeat? I mean, if I'm going to face destruction, I might as well do it to a decent soundtrack. Vectel snorted, a rare smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. I'll see what I can do, but don't hold your breath. This lot couldn't organize a sing-along if their lives depended on it. The corridors echoed with their footsteps as they headed back to the tangled nightmare of wires in the central hub. Vectel had a feeling they hadn't heard the last of this musical mystery. But for now, they had a plan, and as flimsy as it might be, it was better than silence. Think we'll ever figure this out? Corin asked, his voice echoing with the kind of hope that was usually reserved for fairy tales and lottery tickets. Vectel shrugged. Maybe, or maybe we'll just stumble around in the dark until someone trips over the power cord. Hey, that's the spirit, Corin replied with a chuckle. If we're gonna crash and burn, at least we're in it together. Together, Vectel echoed, the word sounding foreign and a bit dangerous. But in a universe where alliances could be as fragile as glass, maybe a little danger was exactly what they needed. Vectel looked at Corin, a human with more optimism than common sense, and realized that despite the odds, he felt a small spark of something he hadn't in a long time, hope, even if it was buried under layers of sarcasm and skepticism. Vectel wasn't naive enough to think they were out of the woods yet. But perhaps with a bit of luck, some clever maneuvering, and a few well-placed power cords, They might just play the tune that would prevent the galaxy from descending into chaos. It was a long shot, but in a universe full of uncertainties, sometimes a long shot was all you had. The Zorak Coalition Council chamber was full of the kind of tension you'd expect between two rival warlords at a bake sale. Vectel sat at the head of the table, trying to look less like a man caught staring at the business end of a blaster. Around him, the other council members, each as charming as a piranha with a hangover, were already splintering into factions, advocating for everything from peaceful negotiations to full-on pyrotechnics. Preemptive strike, Zarnok gurgled, his gelatinous form quivering with the kind of enthusiasm you'd expect from someone suggesting they skip dessert. It's the only way to ensure our safety. Vectel pinched the bridge of his nose, which had become a kind of reflex when dealing with Zarnok's brand of lunacy. You want to start a war over music. Do I need to remind you how that turned out last time? Olgoth, who had somehow managed to exude the charisma of a particularly grumpy boulder, leaned in with his usual melodrama. This isn't just music, Vectel. It's a rallying cry, a potential weapon. Right? Because a catchy chorus is going to dethrone us all, Vectel shot back, sarcasm dripping like toxic sludge. What's next? We arm ourselves against Broadway musicals. Corin, lounging casually in his seat as if he were at a backyard barbecue, chimed in. Hey, don't knock the arts. More revolutions have been started by a good song than a bad speech. Vectel couldn't help but smirk at Corin's irreverence, even as the council chamber felt like it was heating to a boil. Do you have a plan B, Corin? Something that doesn't involve us becoming a cautionary tale, Corin grinned, the kind of grin you'd expect from a man who had just successfully pulled off a card trick. Funny you should ask. I've got an idea. Zarnok's eyes narrowed, suspicious as a cat in a room full of rocking chairs. What kind of idea? Corin slapped a handheld console down on the table, the device buzzing with a chaotic energy that matched its owner. We broadcast back, show them we're listening, not threatening. Olgoth raised a skeptical eyebrow, his face pulling more gravity than a collapsing star. And how do you propose we do that without revealing our position? Corin leaned back, arms crossed behind his head. We piggyback on their signal, give them a taste of their own medicine, only friendlier. A message of partnership, not panic. Zarnok's gelatinous form shifted uneasily. Risky. What if they see it as an attack? Vectel sighed, the sound of a man caught between a rock and a hard place. Only the rock was sentient and the hard place had a vendetta. Risky, yes. But maybe less risky than lighting the fuse on a war. The debate raged on, the kind of circular argument that left Vectel feeling like he'd been dragged through a fault line. For every cautious voice advocating restraint, there was another calling for the preemptive use of firepower that could convert a community center into a crater. All I'm saying, Corin interjected, his voice cutting through the cacophony like a well-tuned knife, is that if we act first, we dictate the terms. We show them we're not the enemy. And if they don't see it that way, Olgoth challenged, his eyes narrowing to slits. Corin shrugged with a nonchalance that could only be rivaled by a teenager at a school dance. Then we'll be the first to know they've got lousy taste in music and diplomacy. Despite the council's division, Vectel felt a flicker of hope in Corin's plan. In a universe where alliances were as rare as a discount at a high-end boutique, maybe a bit of daring was exactly what they needed. As the meeting dragged on, Vectel found himself cornered in more ways than one. He doubted Corin's intentions, his mind doing cartwheels over every potential pitfall. Was this genuinely about peace, or was Corin playing a longer game? His thoughts were interrupted by the council chamber's doors slamming open, a harried aide stumbling in with all the grace of a drunkard on roller skates. "Councillor Vectel," she gasped, urgent message from the central hub. Vectel exchanged a glance with Corin, who merely arched an eyebrow, apparently as intrigued as he was. "What now?" Vectel muttered, half expecting the universe to throw another curveball. The aide, catching her breath, handed over a data pad. "It's the music broadcasts. They've intensified." Zarnok's form wobbled with something akin to panic. See, they're preparing for something. Or they've just decided to up the tempo, Corin offered, humor dancing in his eyes. Who doesn't love a good crescendo? Vectel rubbed his temples, wishing for the umpteenth time that he'd chosen a career less fraught with melodrama. All right, he said, resignation settling like a lead blanket. Let's hear Corin's plan. The council buzzed with skepticism and dissent, but for now, it seemed they were willing to humor the humans' idea, if only because they lacked a better one. Corin looked unusually serious as he leaned in, tapping on the console with the air of someone about to show off a neat party trick. We broadcast during one of their transmissions. Slip in a message of peace, an invitation to talk. Ulgoth snorted, a sound like gravel being chewed. And you're sure they'll understand it, Corin nodded. The music signals are coordinated. We slip in something their receivers will pick up. Trust me, when you've spent enough time with ancient tech, you learn a few tricks. Vectel raised an eyebrow. And if it goes wrong? Corin's grin widened, wolfish and daring. Then we'll know it faster than you can say intergalactic incident. The council wasn't convinced, not entirely. But they were out of options, and Vectel knew that sometimes desperation was the mother of concession. All right, he said finally. Let's roll the dice. As the council dispersed, grumbling and muttering like a pack of disgruntled hyenas, Corin clapped a hand on Vectel's shoulder. You made the right call, Vectel nodded, though his confidence was as shaky as a jelly on a high-speed train. I hope so, for all our sakes. Together, they headed back through the labyrinthine corridors to the central hub, where wires tangled like a nest of vipers waiting to strike. Vectel couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking a tightrope, with the ground a long way down and no safety net in sight. Corin set to work on the console, fingers dancing across the keys with practiced ease. You know, for a guy who hates music, you're surprisingly good at this, Vectel commented. Corin shrugged, not taking his eyes off the screen. Spent a lot of time listening. Figured if I wanted to survive, I should start paying attention. As Corin worked, Vectel's doubts gnawed at him like a persistent itch. Was Corin really trying to help, or was there another agenda hidden beneath his easygoing exterior? In a place where betrayal could be traded like currency, trust was a luxury few could afford. Corin glanced up, catching Vectel's eye. You look worried. Only when I breathe, Vectel replied dryly. Think this will really work? Corin tapped a final command, setting the transmission in motion. If it doesn't, at least we'll give them something to talk about at our funeral. Vectel couldn't help but chuckle, though it was a sound tinged with unease. Comforting thought. As they waited, the silence stretched out, heavy and oppressive, the air buzzing with expectation. Vectel realized, not for the first time, that he was neck-deep in a scheme that could either save them or condemn them. When the console finally beeped, indicating the broadcast had been sent, Corin leaned back, exuding satisfaction. Now we wait. Vectel nodded, trying to ignore the pit in his stomach. And if they respond with guns instead of words? Corin's eyes were steady, his humor absent for once. Then we'll know we tried. Better to go down swinging than sit here waiting to be picked off. Vectel appreciated the sentiment, but he knew that words offered little comfort against the cold void of space and the threat of impending doom. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that maybe, just maybe, the gamble might pay off. As they sat in the dim glow of the central hub, waiting for a response that might never come, Vectel knew they were at the mercy of the universe, a universe that had never been known for its kindness. Here's hoping they're more interested in a duet than a duel, Corin quipped, trying to lighten the mood. Vectel snorted, though the sound was hollow. If not, let's hope they have terrible aim. The waiting was the worst part, the minutes dragging into an eternity as they watched the console for any sign of a reply. Vectel found himself pondering the absurdity of it all, how a few notes strung together could dictate the fate of worlds. Think they'll answer? Corin asked, his voice a whisper in the gloom. Vectel sighed, the weight of uncertainty pressing down like a heavy blanket. I don't know, but whatever happens, it's been a hell of a ride. Corin chuckled, a sound filled with defiance and a touch of madness. Who knew the universe would be so melodramatic? As they sat in companionable silence, surrounded by the jumble of forgotten technology, Vectel couldn't help but feel a grudging respect for the human beside him. In a galaxy where alliances were as fickle as the weather, perhaps the strongest bonds were forged in the face of adversity. "Whatever happens," Vectel said, his voice carrying a resolve he hadn't felt in years, "we're in this together." Corin nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. Together. The console beeped again, its screen lighting up with a message. Vectel's heart skipped a beat as he leaned in, his eyes scanning the text. It wasn't much, just a simple acknowledgement of their transmission, an invitation to talk. Corin let out a triumphant whoop, punching the air with glee. They responded. I knew it would work. Vectel felt a grin spread across his face, a rare expression these days. Looks like we might survive after all. Corin clapped him on the back, his laughter infectious. Guess they do have good taste in music. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, hope flickered in Vectel's chest. It was a fragile thing, easily snuffed out, but it was there nonetheless, a small light in the vast darkness. And in a galaxy where certainty was as rare as courtesy at a council meeting, Vectel would take what he could get. The council chamber buzzed with the kind of tension that could make a black hole blush. The air was thick with the collective skepticism of warlords who'd seen it all and trusted none of it. Vectel stood at the heart of it, juggling the weight of responsibility like a clown with a few too many pins. The recent success, if you could call it that, of their little musical gamble hung in the air like a particularly persistent odor. "So, Corin," Vectel began, scratching at the back of his neck with the kind of irritation reserved for bureaucrats and bad haircuts. "You've convinced them to talk. Now what?" Corin, lounging in his chair like he owned the place, or at least rented it on the weekends, grinned. "Now, my dear Vectel, we take it up a notch. Show them what we've got." "Assuming we've got anything to show," Ulgoth grumbled, arms crossed and eyes narrow as if he were trying to outstare a supernova. "Trust me," Corin replied, his grin widening to shark-like proportions. "We've got something. It's all about finding the right frequency. Hit the sweet spot, and even the most stubborn species will dance to our tune." Zarnok's gelatinous form rippled with something approaching disbelief. "And we're supposed to believe that music can unite us." Sounds like a plot from a particularly sappy holoflick. "Think of it as an intergalactic jam session," Corin quipped, tapping on his handheld console with the precision of a surgeon and the enthusiasm of a kid in a candy store. "Except instead of candy, we've got potential allies, and instead of kids, we've got, well, you lot." The chamber erupted into a mix of grunts, huffs, and a few amused snorts. Vectel glanced at the others, gauging their reactions. They were a motley crew, to be sure, each with a head harder than the rocks they'd crawled out from under. But even here, in the midst of skepticism and sarcasm, there was a glimmer of curiosity. "All right, Corin," Vectel said, folding his arms and giving a nod that was more resigned than confident. "Show us what you've got." With a flourish, Corin activated the console. The chamber lights dimmed, and a series of holographic displays flickered to life, casting an eerie glow over the room. The displays showed various colonies scattered across the galaxy, each one isolated and stubbornly independent, much like the Council itself. "This," Corin began, his voice suddenly serious, "is a harmonic convergence. Think of it as a universal language. Music, as it turns out, isn't just sound. It's vibration, frequency, something that can resonate with just about anything, or anyone." Ulgoth scratched his chin, skepticism etched into his features. "And how exactly is that supposed to help us?" "Patience, my gravelly friend," Corin replied, his fingers dancing over the console's keys. "Let me show you." With a few deft keystrokes, Corin initiated the sequence. The displays flickered again, this time showing lines of energy linking the colonies. The music began soft at first, a gentle hum like a distant nebula's whisper, then building into a symphony of sound that filled the chamber with its power. It was a strange, haunting melody, the kind that got under your skin and settled in your bones. And as it played, something remarkable began to happen. The energy lines between the colonies started to pulse in time with the music, brightening with each crescendo. Vector watched, his skepticism slowly eroding. Is this real? Real as the scars on your hide, Corin replied, eyes gleaming with a mix of pride and mischief. This is what music can do. It connects us if we let it. Makes us more than the sum of our parts. Zarnok's form shimmered with a mix of excitement and disbelief. If it can unite the colonies, it can unite us, Corin finished, his voice carrying a conviction that was hard to argue with. Turn a bunch of isolated outposts into something greater. Make us a force to be reckoned with. The room fell silent, save for the hum of the music and the whispers of possibility. Even Olgoth, who'd been the most vocal skeptic, seemed lost in thought, his usual grumpiness replaced by something akin to wonder. Vector felt a cautious hope take root in his chest, a rare visitor to be sure. It was a long shot, a gamble with more risk than a three-legged race on ice, but it was something. He turned to Corin, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. You've got away with theatrics, I'll give you that. Corin gave a mock bow, his grin irrepressible. All part of the charm. The council members exchanged glances, the previous discord now tinged with a hint of unity. They'd seen something today, something that suggested maybe, just maybe, their future wasn't set in stone. Olgoth, never one to let sentiment linger too long, cleared his throat. All right, you've got our attention, but how do we make sure this works? We can't just sit around holding hands and singing Kumbaya. Corin nodded, acknowledging the practicality of the question. We need commitment. Each of you has to go back to your territories and start broadcasting this signal. Make it a constant, a presence they can't ignore. And if they decide to ignore it anyway, Zarnok asked, skepticism still clinging on like an unwanted guest. Then we try something else, Corin replied with a shrug. But we won't know until we try, right? Vector looked around the chamber, at the faces of those he'd fought and argued with for longer than he cared to remember. For once they seemed to be on the same page, if only tentatively. Let's put this to a vote, Vector said, straightening his posture. All in favor of Corin's plan, raise your hand. Hesitantly, hands began to rise one by one. It wasn't unanimous, but it was enough, a fragile consensus that might just hold. Looks like you're a hit, Vector said to Corin, his tone laced with both surprise and relief. Corin chuckled, leaning back in his seat with an air of triumph. Never underestimate the power of a catchy tune. The council began to disperse, the atmosphere lighter than it had been in a long time. Vector lingered, watching them go, feeling the weight of the future pressing down like an ill-fitted suit. Think it'll work? He asked Corin, unable to keep the doubt from his voice. Corin tilted his head, considering. I think it's got a shot, and in this business a shot's better than nothing. Vector nodded, the truth of that settling in his mind. It was a gamble, sure, but then again, what wasn't in this universe? As they left the chamber, Vector found himself standing a little taller, his stride a little firmer. Despite the odds, despite the cynicism that had become second nature, there was something exhilarating about daring to hope. Let's see how the universe likes our new symphony, Corin said, clapping Vector on the shoulder as they walked. Vector chuckled, the sound rough and unused. If they don't, at least they'll have something to remember us by. Together they navigated the twisted corridors of the central hub, where wires hung like the entrails of some mechanical beast, and yet now, even these seemed to pulse with a new energy. The hum of machinery was almost musical, a fitting backdrop for their next steps. What's your angle, Corin? Vector asked suddenly, stopping in the middle of the hallway. You're not the type to do this out of sheer goodwill. What's in it for you? Corin paused, his expression unreadable for a moment. Then he shrugged, offering a lopsided smile. Survival, mostly, same as you. And hey, uniting the galaxy sounds like a hell of a legacy, doesn't it? Vector considered that, weighing the sincerity behind Corin's words. In a world full of deception and dark corners, he'd learned to trust actions over words, but maybe, just maybe, this was one of those rare moments where the two aligned. Well, here's hoping the universe has room for one more conductor, Vectel said. Corin laughed, the sound echoing down the corridor. If not, we'll just have to make some noise until they make room. Together, they continued their path, their destination uncertain but their resolve stronger than it had been in years. The galaxy was a big, dangerous place, but for the first time it felt a little less lonely. And that might just make all the difference. The echoes of their footsteps faded into the distance, leaving behind the soft hum of electricity, a sound that, for now, was oddly comforting. They were united by a shared goal, a shared hope, and perhaps most importantly, a shared belief that the future could be different. And as they moved forward, one thing became clear. Whatever happened next, they would face it together. The council chamber was a testament to opposing perspectives, as accommodating as a porcupine at a balloon convention. Vectel observed the assembly, a curious mix of skepticism and resignation etched on every face. Each council member was a stubborn asteroid, possibly on a collision course with common sense. "All right, you magnificent bastards," Vectel began, trying to inject a bit of enthusiasm into his tone. "We've got a chance to turn this thing around. Human music isn't just noise pollution. It's a chance to communicate without blowing each other to space dust." Zarnok, quivering slightly, seemed to find its voice, or whatever passed for it in a gelatinous entity. And we're really supposed to believe in the power of Bieber diplomacy. It made a sound that could have been a laugh or an unfortunate digestive event. "Next thing you know, we'll be hosting karaoke nights. Think of it as a universal campfire song," Corin interjected, his grin as wide as a black hole. "Except instead of marshmallows, we've got peace treaties. And instead of campers, we've got, well, you lot." Olgoth crossed his arms tighter, his face a permanent scowl. "Music's all well and good, but I've seen how much damage a bad tune can do. Last time I heard Interstellar Love on repeat, I nearly joined a cult." "Good," Vectel replied, sarcasm dripping from his words like oil from a leaky engine. "Then you're exactly the kind of cultural critic we need. But seriously, if we don't reach out, we might as well set our facers to extinct." The chamber buzzed with the usual cocktail of grunts and sighs, but Vectel noticed a few nods of reluctant agreement. It was progress, even if it felt like dragging a starship through a tar pit. Corin, never one to miss a moment of theatricality, tapped his console and let the music play again. This time it was something more upbeat, a rhythm that seemed to coax movement from even the most stoic council members. "See," Corin said, eyes gleaming with the fervor of a preacher on a mission. "We're already tapping feet we didn't know we had." Olgoth emitted a noise that might have been agreement or gas, hard to tell with him. "All right, say this works. Say the music actually gets these blockheads to the table." "What then, we talk," Vectel replied, the word feeling as bold as suggesting a holiday in a war zone. "We offer a hand instead of a fist. Share tech, trade routes, maybe even some of those god-forsaken pop albums." Zarnok wobbled with curiosity. "And if they refuse," Vectel shrugged, though his mind was racing with contingencies, none of them particularly pleasant. "Then we'll at least know we tried. And we can always go back to the simpler approach of mutually assured destruction." The mention of destruction seemed to catch everyone's attention, a strangely comforting fallback. After all, in a universe full of chaos, the threat of annihilation was as reliable as gravity. "Let's put it to a vote," Vectel suggested, hoping the idea of diplomacy wasn't as terrifying to them as he secretly feared. One by one, hands rose, a begrudging salute to sanity. Even Olgoth's hand crept up, albeit with the reluctance of a man volunteering for a root canal. "Well, that's settled then," Vectel said, suppressing a sigh of relief. "We open dialogue with the human colonies. See what they bring to the table apart from questionable taste in music." The room slowly emptied, leaving Vectel with Corin, who was still basking in his minor triumph. "You think this will work, Corin?" The ever-confident Corin shrugged, his smile undiminished. "It's got a better shot than most of my plans, which isn't saying much, but hey, it's a start." Vectel nodded. It's funny, you know. We've spent so long distrusting each other, a bit of harmony feels like blasphemy, or really bad sci-fi, Corin quipped, tapping his console, presumably queuing up next week's greatest hits. But maybe that's the point. Surprise everyone by doing the unexpected. As they left the chamber, Vectel felt a strange sense of hope. Sure, it was akin to watching a toddler wield a flamethrower, but it was hope nonetheless. The galaxy was still a mess, but at least now they had a soundtrack. Vectel and Corin found themselves walking through the central hub, cables dangling like the universe's least festive decorations. The hum of activity had a new rhythm to it, an underlying beat that spoke of possibilities. "So what's next, Maestro?" Vectel asked, half joking, half anxious. "We get the music out there, see who bites," Corin replied, his mind already racing with potential playlists. "And then we start talking. Probably with a lot of hand signals and bad translations, but it's a start. Funny how it's always the simple things that are the hardest," Vectel mused almost to himself. "Trust, peace, understanding." Corin nodded, his expression thoughtful for once. "Yeah, funny that. But we've got to try, right?" "Yeah," Vectel agreed, feeling the weight of leadership settle back on his shoulders, as familiar and unwelcome as an overdue tax bill. "We've got to try." As they continued their journey through the hub, they couldn't help but feel the weight of their decision. It was like walking on a tightrope between stars, one misstep away from a spectacular fall. But for now, they were moving forward, and maybe, just maybe, they'd hit the right notes. Back in the council chamber, the remaining members were packing up, each lost in their own thoughts. Zarnok, still shimmering with disbelief, turned to Ulgoth. "Do you really think this will change anything?" Ulgoth shrugged, a gesture that spoke more than words ever could. "Hell if I know. But it's either this or keep on fighting until we're all dust. Might as well try something different before we blow our last breath." "Wise words from a grumpy old cynic," Zarnok said, attempting humor. "Perhaps there's hope for us yet. Don't get soft on me now," Ulgoth warned with a gruff chuckle. "We've got a long way to go before we start singing in harmony, or in tune," Zarnok added, rippling with amusement. Ulgoth snorted, casting a last look around the room. "Well, whatever happens, at least we'll have one hell of a soundtrack." Outside the chamber, Vectel and Corin emerged into the wide corridors of the council's main headquarters, a labyrinth of bureaucracy where hope went to die. The lights flickered overhead, occasionally cutting out with a groan, like the universe's worst light show. "Think they'll listen?" Vectel asked, though his voice held more hope than doubt. "They'll listen," Corin asserted, though his tone betrayed a hint of uncertainty. "Whether they'll understand is another matter. In any case, I'm glad you're not a complete idiot," Vectel said, managing a small smile. "Why, Vectel, I didn't know you cared," Corin replied, feigning offense. "Don't worry, I'm sure I'll do something to disappoint you soon enough." "Count on it," Vectel said, his voice dry as the deserts of Sarnath. "Just make sure it's not today." As they reached the end of the corridor, Vectel paused, looking back at the long stretch behind them. It felt symbolic, like the journey they'd embarked upon, fraught with uncertainty, yet filled with potential. "You ever feel like we're just pawns in a cosmic joke?" he asked, his tone contemplative. Corin laughed, the sound echoing in the empty hall. "Constantly. But hey, at least it's a funny one." With a final glance, they stepped out into the bustling activity of the central hub, where the tangled wires and constant hum felt almost welcoming. The universe was still a chaotic mess, but for the first time it felt like they weren't fighting it alone. "Let's go make some noise," Vectel said, the determination in his voice cutting through the din like a laser. "After you, Maestro," Corin replied with a flourish, his grin as irrepressible as hope itself. Together, they ventured into the unknown, their path as unpredictable as the stars they aimed to unite. But for now, they had harmony, a fragile, tentative tune, and that was a start. The council chamber was as solemn as a funeral for a jester. Vectel stood at the helm, facing the newly assembled representatives from the human colonies, each one looking like they were analyzing the room for potential exits in case this diplomatic experiment went sideways. It was time to orchestrate a new symphony of cooperation, or at least try not to screw it up. "Welcome, humans," Vectel began, with an enthusiasm that could have fooled an ice sculpture. "This isn't just another interstellar meet and greet. We're here to talk about a future where music is more than just background noise in a dive bar." The lead human representative, a woman with a face like she could chew nails and ask for more, nodded. "I'm sure we can find common ground, especially if it means less shooting and more." What was it? Bieber diplomacy. Her tone was as dry as a desert martini. Corin, ever the optimist, jumped in. "Think of it as cosmic karaoke. No one knows the words, but we all enjoy watching the spectacle." Ulgoth grumbled from his seat, clearly missing his role as resident naysayer. "As long as no one expects me to sing. The last time I tried, it was banned in 3 systems." "Consider it a mercy," Zarnok chimed in, his gelatinous form rippling with amusement. "But seriously, folks, let's cut to the chase. We all know why we're here. It's not just about music. It's about not blowing each other up because someone hit the wrong note." The human rep, whose name Vectel still couldn't pronounce without needing a drink afterward, leaned forward. "Agreed. Your music broadcasts have been interesting, a bit like discovering a new cuisine. Some tracks are gourmet, others are a dish best served never." There was a rumble of laughter from both sides. It was the first time the council chamber didn't feel like a place where good ideas went to die. "So, how do we make this work?" Vectel asked, cutting through the pleasantries with the precision of a scalpel made of sarcasm. "We propose a cultural exchange," the human replied, with a confidence that suggested she was used to getting what she wanted. "Music, art, technology. Let's show each other we're more than the next big threat." Corin clapped his hands together. "Finally, someone who speaks my language." And here I thought this was going to be another episode of pointless PowerPoint presentations in space. Vectel noted the slight relaxing of shoulders, human and otherwise. It was as if they'd all suddenly realized they'd been clenching their teeth so hard it was a wonder none of them had cracked a molar. There was an unspoken agreement that maybe, just maybe, they weren't all completely idiotic for attempting this. "Of course there are risks," Ulgoth pointed out, always the realist. "Cultural exchanges can lead to misunderstandings, the kind that usually ends with someone getting vaporized." "True," Zarnok agreed, his voice a warble of amusement and foreboding. "But isn't it about time we tried something new before we all end up extinct? I mean, what's the worst that could happen? We end up friends. Or find out we should have stuck to shooting each other," Corin added with a smirk. "But that's a risk I'm willing to take." The humans and council members exchanged glances, the kind that suggested they were all aware this could either be the beginning of a beautiful friendship or a spectacular disaster. But hey, at least it wouldn't be boring. Vectel cleared his throat, a sound like machinery grinding coffee beans. "If we're all agreed, let's draft the terms of this alliance. Music for peace, art for understanding, and the occasional trade in questionable pop albums." "Deal," the human representative said, extending a hand. "Let's not screw this up." Vectel shook it, feeling the weight of their decision settle like a particularly persistent migraine. If it worked, they'd be heroes. If not, they'd be known as the idiots who tried to solve interstellar conflict with a mixtape. As the meeting wrapped up, the various representatives filed out, some looking hopeful, others wary. Vectel stayed behind with Corin, surveying the now empty chamber like generals after a battle, one they'd somehow won without a single shot fired. "You think this will hold?" Vectel asked, not expecting a definitive answer because, well, this was the universe. Nothing was certain except chaos and taxes. Corin shrugged, his trademark grin still in place. "Who knows, but at least we've made a start. Better than watching everything go to hell in a handbasket, right?" "True," Vectel conceded, though he was sure there was a cosmic force somewhere laughing at their attempts. "We might just pull this off. And if not," Corin said, clapping Vectel on the back, We'll at least have some killer tunes to go out on. As they exited the chamber, Vectel couldn't help but smile, albeit ruefully. In a universe that thrived on entropy, they'd taken a step toward something unexpected. A little less destruction, a little more creation. The central hub bustled with activity. The wires still conspired to create the galaxy's worst electronic web, but now it felt charged with purpose. The alliance was fragile, sure, but it was there. A tenuous thread in the vast dark, shimmering with the potential of something beautiful. So, Corin started as they maneuvered through the throng, what do we call this new era of peace? Vectel thought for a moment, letting the music from the console in his pocket hum a gentle background tune. How about the accord of discord? Corin laughed, the sound a warm contrast to the cold, metallic buzz around them. Sounds perfect. Here's to a future of loud music and louder debates. Vectel nodded, feeling a rare sense of optimism. And maybe, just maybe, a little bit of harmony. They walked on, side by side, their path illuminated by the glow of screens and the distant promise of a new beginning. In their wake, the universe continued to spin, chaotic and unpredictable as ever. Zarnok and Olgoth, having lingered behind, watched the pair disappear into the bustling throng. The old cynic and the gelatinous diplomat exchanged a glance. "You think they'll make it?" Zarnok asked, his voice a gurgle of curiosity. Olgoth shrugged, his scowl softer than usual. "If they don't, at least they'll have made a damn good try of it. And who knows? Maybe they'll even surprise us." "High praise," Zarnok chuckled, moving towards the exit. "Come on, let's see if we can't help them keep it together. After all, we're part of this crazy venture, too." Together, they left the chamber, their old rivalries temporarily set aside in favor of a greater cause. The universe was a vast, indifferent place, but for once it felt like a step had been taken toward something brighter. There was still a long way to go, and plenty of potential for disaster, but at least they weren't alone in the endeavor. And with Earth's music as a guide, maybe they'd find a way to make it work. As the last member of the council chamber flicked off the lights, the room settled into silence. Yet within that quietude was a promise that echoed with the beats of a newly composed tune, one that resonated through the corridors of the universe, inviting all to join in the dance of hope. In the days that followed, the alliance took form. Communications channels buzzed with exchanges of culture and music. There were misunderstandings, of course. Turns out a lot of human songs didn't translate well when your species didn't have ears. But there were also moments of genuine connection, where the distance between stars seemed to fade into the background. Vectel watched it all with the kind of cautious optimism usually reserved for first-time parents and intergalactic peace treaties. There were challenges, sure, but with Corin's boundless enthusiasm and the Council's begrudging support, they had a shot. "Think this is what they call a happy ending?" Corin asked, joining Vectel on the observation deck, where they could see the sprawling network of ships and stations, each one a testament to their newfound unity. Vectel chuckled, leaning on the railing as he considered the view. "In a universe like ours, it's more like a pause in the chaos, but it's a start. And that works for me," Corin said, his grin as bright as a supernova. "Here's to starting something new." Together they stood in silence, the future stretching out before them like an uncharted starfield. It was vast, uncertain, full of potential pitfalls and possibilities. But for now, it was a future they were willing to face, armed with the power of music and a shared dream of peace. In the end, it was a reminder that even in the grimmest corners of the universe, there was room for hope, and maybe, just maybe, a bit of harmony.